To continue the conversation, we want to welcome to the stage our first panel of the day on China and the fentanyl crisis. This panel, please come on stage. Oh wait, we need to change the seats, the chairs, don't we? All right, I need to talk a little bit while we add chairs to this. So I will talk a little bit about the incredible moderator of this panel, who is Dr. Erin Calipari. She's a director of Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research and associate professor at Vanderbilt's Department of Pharmacology. Dr. Calipari's career has been focused on studying the neuroscience of drug addiction, identifying how drug use fundamentally changes the brain at the molecular level to give rise to addiction. She's a clear leader in the field of the science of addiction, and she's a perfect moderator for this panel. And it just goes to show how critically important the role academia plays in this crisis, and why this has to be a partnership between government, between the private sector, between academia, and everyone who's sitting out there. At the end of the day, unless we can convince our congressional leaders that this is a national priority, DEA will not get the resources that it needs to solve this crisis and to save American lives. So with that, and I think our chairs are set up, I'd like to welcome the panel to stage.
Hello. You know, this panel is such a perfect example of, should we move? We have one extra chair. Should I move this way? Of the radical collaboration that Chancellor Dearmeyer always talks about at Vanderbilt. I think it's a really, it's going to be a really exciting discussion because it's bringing together people like me and Laurie who really study the biology of addiction, the impact it has on the individual, how it changes kind of who we are as people, how we behave, with the kind of people experience with the government agencies that are really like on the ground trying to solve this problem. And so I think what we'll start with is I'll let each of the panelists introduce yourselves, and then we can kind of get into it. I think they're...
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Kimbell. I'm the Chief of Operations for the Drug Enforcement Administration. I've spent the last 31 years of my life, which is basically all of my adult life, in law enforcement. And I've been blessed to be with the DEA since 1998, so 26 years. I've done a lot of moves, a lot of assignments. I've been all over DEA world. And I'm just really happy to be here today to talk about this really, really tragic circumstances happening in this country. So I thank you for everyone for being here and letting me present this morning.
Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Laurie Cutting. I am at Vanderbilt University. I'm an associate provost in the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and Innovation. I'm also a professor at Peabody and also have some appointments in the School of Medicine and Engineering. And my work focuses on the cognitive neuroscience of children's development. And most recently, we have been awarded a National Institutes of Health grant to study the effects of opioid addiction on child development.
Good morning, I'm Mike Nordwall. My current assignment within the FBI is the Assistant Director over our Criminal Investigative Division. Been in the FBI for 22 years and really split my time between the counterterrorism and the criminal fight. Within CID, or the Criminal Investigative Division with FBI, we oversee all criminal programs for the FBI. That's everything from civil rights to public corruption to healthcare fraud to safe streets or violent gangs, as well as transnational organized crime. Those last three really work together in fighting, whether it's the opioid epidemic or what we're seeing with fentanyl and other poisons coming across the border and really infecting our communities.
Good morning. My name is Margaret Stromecki. I am with the MITRE Corporation, which is an FFRDC. I came out of government. I was senior executive at the Central Intelligence Agency for about 20 years. and have covered a whole range of issues, most in terms of sort of these functional areas. CT, I work closely with the FBI in that topic area. At MITRE, I lead what we call the Counter-PRC cell, which is looking at supporting the intelligence community and broader DoD efforts in countering the China threat and looking at issues like fentanyl, like illicit money laundering, like social media and disinformation and propaganda manipulation, and of course many of our economic and technological challenges that we face with China.
Okay, so we cover kind of all the bases. Okay, so first things first, if you have questions, you can email them and they will come to me. But I think, so what we're talking about today is kind of fentanyl in China and the impact this has on the United States. And so I think what's really important to start with is maybe some historical context. And so I'm looking at you, Margaret, because I feel like you are probably best equipped to answer this question. So maybe you can kick us off talking a little bit about the historical context of kind of how we got here.
Yeah, and in conversations in preparation for this panel, there was interest in talking about the Chinese long-standing history with opioids and how that has affected their perspective on this topic area. So it was mentioned yesterday, the opium wars in the 19th century and how they have shaped Chinese thinking on this topic. So back in the day when the East India British Company governed India, they intentionally shipped opium to China and developed addiction and broad usage there through that shipment. Additionally, after Britain took over, there were the British were involved in that. British companies, the United States companies got involved through shipping opium through Turkey. There were two wars, the Opium Wars in the 19th century, both of which resulted in major losses for China. That was when Hong Kong was transitioned to the British. That was when many of the ports, I don't know if any of you have been to Shanghai, but it's the historic quarters were governed by Western European powers. So the Chinese have responded to this particular conflict, which is, or tension area with the United States, one that is asymmetric, I would say. It's a national security threat to us for sure. To them, it's something of an annoyance. By looking at their past history, by lauding the fact that when Mao came into power, that he really was able to eradicate the opium usage and kept the country relatively drug-free for many years. When Deng Xiaoping came in and liberalized the country a bit, that's when there started to be a little bit more drug usage, but the Chinese still maintain that they are a country that does not use drugs, does not produce drugs, and is not part of this problem space. The problem lies with U.S. demand. Our DEA administrator noted, it was in the time period when opioids became such a problem in the United States. The Chinese noted that, started to produce synthetic opioids, and that's where the fentanyl production started as they pivoted to the precursors that led to the production being in Mexico. But as our DEA Administrator Margaret pointed out, they still make a lot of pill presses. They advertise on social media. They make it very easy to gain access to their precursors. And a current problem now, of course, is the dual-use precursors. There's a lot of transitioning among the different precursors that help them avoid the scheduled issue of the chemicals.
Okay, so this is, I mean, this is an interesting issue, right? Because they're shipping these precursors, and it's causing kind of a lot of different problems. So we have people from DEA and FBI. Maybe you guys, for me as scientists, can start by talking about a little bit maybe how you guys are collaborating. Like, where do you guys differ? Like, what kinds of things are you handling separately, and what things are you doing together to work on? Either one of you can take that.
Well, I mean, I'll start out and then I'll let Will talk, but I will say there's no daylight between the FBI and DEA on our focus on the fentanyl epidemic, what we're seeing with Sinaloa and CJNG, and we work together through certainly at the headquarters level, but also in the field, out in those offices internationally, through task forces, through strike forces that come together where we bring state, locals, tribal elements together where we can collectively use our authorities, our capabilities, and just our reach to have as much, be able to inflict as much risk and consequences on these individuals that are involved in the whole supply chain, from precursors all the way to the actual dealing on the streets. I will say on the FBI, and I mentioned that there were 3 fronts or 3 programs that we really focus on as we address this. Of course, there's the healthcare fraud, whether it's counterfeit prescription pills, whether it's diversion or overprescription of opioids without medical necessity. Also, our transnational criminal organization, or TCO or TOC groups that focus on the cartels, focus on the supply chains, how they bring these narcotics, these illegal drugs into the United States, and then our safe streets or our violent gang task forces that are looking at really those, whether it's neighborhood-based or whether it's national gangs that are really involved in a lot of the distribution of the pills, of the drugs on the street. I think of note last year, within all the seizures that we had in the gang program, most of them, over 75%, involved fentanyl. I mean, this is it's in the hands everywhere. Something else where I know we're closely partnered with DA and other agencies is on the darknet. J-Code. J-Code is the Joint Criminal Opioid Darknet Enforcement. It's a lot easier to say J-Code. But it's really an alliance, a partnership that was stood up within DOJ by the AG back in 2018. There are currently 12 federal agencies that are part of this, but it's really using all of our technical expertise and working with other experts to not only on the darknet, on the clearnet, go after these darknet marketplaces, these prolific vendors, and the people that are buying a lot of this fentanyl and other synthetics for further distribution, throughout our communities.
And I think one of the things that we focus on really heavily is identifying the chemical manufacturing companies in China that are responsible for the precursors and other drugs now, such as xylazine and nitazines. In May 2019, when China outlawed all the fentanyl and their analogs, it dried up the amount of fentanyl that we were seeing imported into the U.S. Before that, from 2013 to 2019, we were everywhere in the U.S. we were receiving parcels that were filled with smaller amounts of fentanyl. 300 grams was a typical shipment. And so China is very effective when they want to be at stopping the problem. So it's not on their part that they can't do it. It's that right now they're not willing to. So we're identifying the Chinese companies, and we're infiltrating them through undercover means. We have special teams that they do nothing but this. They search online. Generally, what we find is we find these companies through Google searches. It's on OpenNet as well as the darknet. And then we start talking to a representative. They speak perfect English, and they go into a secure network like Signal or something else, WhatsApp, and then they really consummate the transaction. So we use that, and then we get nitazines, xylazine, precursors, and then we have it shipped to wherever we need to in the world. And we look to prosecute and hold those companies responsible, because a lot of those companies have legitimate business, and this is kind of a side project for them. There's a lot of evidence out there. There's a lot of talking points out there.
Can I ask you what this was in the back of my mind. What else are these precursors used for? So we can't just prevent them from coming in because they're going to legitimate uses. Like, what are those legitimate uses?
Well, there's about 10 precursor chemicals for fentanyl that don't have a lot of secondary uses. And I'll kind of highlight this too. What we've really seen from the Chinese companies, and after 2019, the Mexican cartels took the torch. They took the torch and they started making the fentanyl pills, and the cartels took it to a different level because of the routes of administration that they allowed the customer base to use. But the Chinese companies, they've made this very simple for chemists. We won't say they're chemists. We always joke in DEA, we have their Walter Whites that are real, they're trained professors that know about chemicals, and we have the Jessies who are just people that throw chemicals together and hope for the best. So the chemical companies in China provide very, very basic steps. Here's your 4 chemicals. You throw these chemicals in at certain different mixtures, and voila, you have fentanyl. And that's one of the things that I want to highlight of how really nefarious this is, because it's turned it into a very, very global market, and it's very simple to make.
Yeah, so one thing you both brought up is how much fentanyl is in things. And so this really brings up a problem that we're seeing in the kind of things we study, is that, you know, in the past, people were taking drugs intentionally, right? They were trying to take specific drugs, and now fentanyl is in everything. And so we're seeing a lot of what I think people are starting to shift their language around this and call it fentanyl poisoning instead of overdose, because it was not intentional. How does that fit in? Is putting things in all of those things intentional? Is it kind of like a supply and demand thing? Is it trying to get new populations of people addicted, or like kind of what was your guys' take on that situation?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's done with purpose. Mm-hmm. It's done, the powdered fentanyl that came in from China initially broadened the user base because it was easy to inhale, it was easy to ingest in multiple different forms. And if you think about the old heroin, the old heroin users, it was all needles and back alley stuff. That went away with social media, and it went away with the routes of administration that the cartels were able to really utilize. Pills, it looks just like the pills. I mean, we've seen kids that thought they were getting a MDMA tablet or an Adderall, which is very popular with children today, and it was fentanyl. And so it's really masked, and that's opened the door for a whole new set of users that would have not been there in 20 years ago. Right.
Yeah, no, and just to go on that, expanding the user base, I mean, I know we've seen in recent months and years where they're pressing pills that look like Skittles. It's multicolors, looks like candy, and all that's to get it out. And, you know, these kids, our vulnerable youth and citizens are taking these pills, whether they think they were manufactured by a foreign bio company, or whether it's candy, and they're not knowing what they're taking, not intentionally taking it, and they're dying. It's tragic.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really important to note about substance use disorder is that, you know, we really don't have a cure. So when you're creating a new population of people who have this disorder, we don't have an effective way to cure it. We have some interventions, like you've probably heard of methadone and Suboxone, to reduce kind of overdoses or prevent, you know, relapse in people who are treatment seeking, but there isn't a magic bullet right now to solve this issue. So this is an issue that's growing, but it's not one that we're going to be able to solve really quickly. It's a thing that's going to be lasting a very long time. And actually, so that actually brings up something. So Laurie and I know each other because we both are faculty here at Vanderbilt. And one of the things that she's been studying is the impact of fentanyl on, you know, the next generation, on children that are born from mothers who actually have taken this drug. And so I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about, you know, the impact that this has, not just on the government, but the individual.
So, you know, we have talked a lot about fentanyl deaths and, you know, Ford Ray that was brought up this morning. Really, I have to say, it really sort of jolted me thinking about how all the conversations that I've had with my children about the fact that these things are hidden in lots of things, that they may think that they're taking something completely different and have fentanyl in it. So I'm appropriately freaked out again, thank you. And it'll probably be a moment of dinner conversation again, which my kids will roll their eyes. But when you think about deaths, of course, you're thinking about that also, you know, affects an enormous family system, right? You've lost a child or you lost a parent. But then there's also the situation where you have a lot of families where, you know, there isn't death. And as was pointed out this morning, the 107,000 deaths, it's magnified by many in terms of the impact on the whole family. And so right now, about 40% of children who are in foster care have been taken away because of drug-related issues, drug-related neglect. And then when you get down to the things that we're studying in terms of impact on brain development, the children who are born from mothers who are addicted to opioids, they show sort of lifelong developmental impacts. So they're sort of at a disadvantage from the start in terms of their cognitive development, their academic development, and their motor development. So we know that this has, really adverse effects all the way from disrupting a whole family system in terms of death to children being taken away from their caregivers because of drug use, and then impacts on the brain and development.
Okay, one thing I want to remind you, if you have questions, you can email them so that we can answer them. But what Laurie just touched on, I guess this is more for everyone else on the panel. Do you think this is intentional? Like, is this part of the goal? Is part of the goal to kind of disrupt, American life and families for long term? Is that something that you think is kind of the reason that some of this is happening?
You mean China?
Yeah.
That's not my assessment, but I do, hearkening back to their troubled history with opioids and their resentment to the against the West. I think they have lack of will in tackling this, and a couple other points to raise on that front. And I know excuse me, I do have a cold. I know my colleagues will weigh in on sort of sanctions and efforts that the United States has taken to try to bring China more into the fold on this issue. One is that their pharmaceutical industry is very powerful. It's one of the major producers, along with India, of pharmaceuticals globally. The United States alone imports $10 billion of pharmaceuticals from China. So the dual-use chemicals, the scrutiny, the willingness to enforce and monitor behaviors in the pharmaceutical industry is not something that the Chinese government is particularly interested in doing. That's a very powerful contingency in their ecosystem. And I think that has, so the intentional no, negligence, absolutely, and unwillingness to be helpful is a huge component of this.
Yeah, so I guess, we're talking a lot about the impact on individuals and addiction, but this has impacts on communities, and I think we talked before about kind of gang violence and things like that. And so I guess how is like the FBI looking at how to kind of tackle some of those issues, and kind of how bad is it, and what is the impact there?
Sure, and it does. It absolutely, we're talking about addiction, we're talking about overdoses or poisonings, but it has so much more effects. And this is historical also, I think, with the cartels, whether it's corruption at the international, at the domestic level on the border, whether it's human trafficking, and certainly violence. I know you've heard a lot of talk over the past several years about the rise in violence on the streets, and certainly, as I mentioned before, fentanyl, you can't necessarily separate that from what we're seeing, what the gangs are peddling, what they try to increase market share, increase territory. All of that feeds into the violence, the destruction of families, but then also the destruction of communities. My most recent position, I oversaw the office out of Pittsburgh, where we also had overview over the entire state of West Virginia, which has been hit among the worst as far as lethal overdoses. If it's not number one, it's a close second. And to see communities robbed of their identity that are being held captive for a profit, because I do think at the end of the day, it's profit and power that's driving what we're seeing. It's sobering. And it's how we attack it is through those multiple programs. But I do think so much of it is also outreach within the communities, outreach to the schools. FBI is often out in the schools talking about child exploitation, about online safety. But online safety also, refers to peddling of these pills, whether it's Snapchat or other social media. Like, be mindful of what you take, because what you take can kill you, and it is killing people. And it's part of that kind of multi-pronged effort that we have.
I'm like fascinated with the social media and the internet. Right, this is just like a different landscape with the internet and the access and things like that. Can maybe both of you can talk a little bit about how social media is being used to target individuals, but also how drugs are being distributed through this in ways that maybe are more difficult to track than in the past?
Yeah, I think the real game changer, if you think about this, if you look at it from the cartel's perspective, back, when they were primarily dealing in cocaine, there was a significant expense that they had already paid out to get the cocaine into Mexico at our border. That cocaine was only given to trusted members of their organization within the United States, because there was a significant loss in money if something happened to it. This is so cheap that now you don't have to know someone in the cartel. You can literally find someone on social media, agree to buy, let's say you buy 1,000 pills of M30, they FedEx it to you, you wire the money back or send cryptocurrency, and if they don't get their money back from the 1,000 pills, they're not really out anything. But most of the time they do, because that's now established a dealer in a local community that feeds gangs and violence and everything else. But there's really, it's removed that inherent trust factor that the cartels used to have. Back in the days, you had to know a drug dealer to find a kilo of cocaine. You had to know multiple people. Now, a couple searches, and you can have someone bring it to your house, and that's happened time and time again.
Does this make it harder to prosecute too, because it's not huge volumes you're seeing anymore, it's smaller individual transactions?
Yes, it is more and more difficult because the problem is more and more widespread. It takes a lot more technology and infrastructure to find the dealers now and to trace the money going back.
And I agree. And just to kind of couple on with what Will said, it's no longer necessarily that hand-to-hand on the corner, because within social media, if a child or a youth reposts something, it's now open up to all of their friend base. If that gets reposted again, all of a sudden this story or this really sales pitch goes out, and it's within minutes is thousands of new users, new potential users.
And I guess just to sort of follow up on that, one of the things that I think is not the case is that it's not common knowledge, and I think you were talking about the bit this morning. It really is not common knowledge that this can be hidden in so many different, pills, and that is something that I think schools probably need to do a lot more informing of. Because people are surprised, like kids are surprised, at least mine have been.
Well, and one thing, that we maybe haven't clearly touched on is kind of why the high potency of this drug is actually making it more difficult. So all of these drugs, heroin, morphine, oxycodone, fentanyl, they all act on your mu opioid receptor. That's what I do in my lab. But they do it at different potencies. What it means is that some of these drugs are much stronger than others at doing this. And what that means is you need much less drug. So fentanyl is so potent that the amount you need is really small. And so what this is doing is shifting how these things can be distributed, because the volumes that you're distributing have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's way easier to hide it in pills, ship it different places. And so not only that, it also has, you're more likely to overdose, and it has a higher addiction potential. And so, it's this kind of complicated problem. As that drugs get bigger, they're impacting our society in all of these ways. That's not just making it more difficult for the individual, but it's also making it difficult for all of us to kind of interfere. So I guess, not that this is a good question, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? So I guess what it is it that we need to come together across these different fields, because we're all doing the thing we're doing in our own space, is kind of chipping away at little parts of the problem, but not an overall solution? I guess, how is the DEA, what are you guys looking at, thinking about how to tackle this kind of overwhelming issue?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we've done is the public outreach. We have to educate the populace. I get asked all the time, well, when do we start talking to our kids about this? And I always tell people, if they're in junior high and you haven't had this conversation, you're almost too late. Because kids are exposed at such a young age to everything nowadays, through social media, through TV. They see a lot more than we think they see. So public outreach is key. Also, I think the law enforcement agencies federally have united over the last couple of years to fight this. It's just an extremely, extremely tough battle. Political pressure has to be put on China and Mexico. China specifically for the precursors, and Mexico specifically to stop the cartel activity in their own country. That's a significant challenge. We have a significant challenge with corruption in these countries. And at the very highest level of our government, that has to be we have to put pressure on them to stop both China and Mexico to really stop this. We can't prosecute our way out of this. We can't arrest our way out of this. There's no families that's not touched by this. We have to unite as a government, unite as a populace, and really force action on these two countries.
I also think one thing that would be helpful is to understand a little bit more about the vulnerability of people who become addicted to them. And that is, one of the goals of this grant that Erin mentioned, is to try to understand the entire sort of family system, the vulnerabilities of both the caregivers and, of course, what happens to the children. But that's the idea. And I think we don't understand quite as much as we could in terms of being able to then develop effective interventions.
Well, and I guess one of the things that you see with a lot of kind of drug trafficking is that you have communities that are really kind of torn apart by this, right? You have gang violence and things like that. And one thing we do know from research is that instability, stress increases the likelihood of people developing substance use disorder. And so it's kind of this huge system, right, where you have the political aspect of it, the community aspect of it, the individual aspect of it, and then all of those things are kind of synergizing, making it an even worse situation than we want it to be. How do you deal with, a lot of like the impact of like gang violence on communities and how that influences individuals? I guess, how are you guys addressing that?
So again, it comes back to this theme of so much of what we do is with partnerships, whether it's in law enforcement, but also within communities, finding those communities that are hardest hit, finding those key anchors within the community to leverage their kind of reach within that for education. But I mean, it's very difficult right now. Youth violence, youth involvement, not only in distribution of narcotics, but in the gang activity is creating a huge problem, not just federally, but I think in all the states. But it's that constant outreach across not just law enforcement, but across public health, but community leaders, and trying to work together to address it at the root.
Okay, so I have a question about like the financial implications of this. So obviously this is generating enormous amounts of revenue that is illegal, right? Like money laundering, like talk a little bit about those kinds of issues and how that's happening. Are these transactions happening with Cash App, Venmo, or are these like, how is this money being transferred and how is it being laundered?
In all forms, but the big change, the big shift is with Cash App, with Venmo, with cryptocurrency. We're watching with our partners at FBI, we're watching global money movements through cryptocurrency. It's instantaneous, it's widespread. We're tracking hundreds of millions of dollars that go across just from the fentanyl supply chain alone. And at the very end of the process, at the end of our chain is the money laundering piece, and China's heavily involved in that as well. They've in the domestic United States and in Mexico, they've taken over the money laundering contracts for the cartels. Sometimes they charge nothing to move money. They do mirror transactions globally, and it's very, very sophisticated, and it is based on their culture of trust that China shares. It would never work in another criminal organization, but it works because of their trust in their culture, and really that's why we really see that it's a focused effort on their part.
So when you're dealing with these kinds of things, this DEA, FBI, like who else needs to be involved in these kinds of things? Because you're talking about, information and collecting information on other countries, on our country, on individuals. Like how are we finding out this information, and like how are we tracking people, and what are like the limitations like legally of like who you can track and how? I mean, this is obviously a really complicated issue.
Well, one of the things that we do is we share intelligence with our state and locals, our agencies in the United States, with our other federal partners. We work multiple task forces together to combat illicit finance. So on the U.S. side, we all work together, we share information, and when we identify players in other countries, Colombia, Peru, we send that information to our counterparts there. We have active DEA agents working in 90 countries, and we really leverage those relationships to do the most damage we can against the cartels.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask some of them. What role does the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act play in this work?
I mean, right now, I will say across law enforcement, we are engaged with the intelligence community, but FISA per se does not necessarily play a large role right now in what we're talking about. There are discussions on how we can better leverage our intelligence community assets to learn and better focus our efforts overseas on what's happening, because it is a national security risk. This is affecting lives and the security of our borders and really our way of life. So it's something that we're looking at ways to better leverage our intelligence community counterparts.
I guess, Margaret, you had talked about some bright spots in these kinds of, communications, collaborations. Can you kind of talk a little bit about, the good that you see and things that we can build on that we're doing already?
Yeah, sure. And I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about how we can potentially move the Chinese a little bit on this issue. But I would say there is broad recognition throughout the intelligence community and DoD that this is a major national security issue. It was the Director of National Intelligence in her annual threat assessment raised it as a huge crisis. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, allocated a lot of resources to this problem space. I know our intelligence community partners are very active in this space. CIA that I'm familiar with is very engaged on this issue. So I think there's a recognition about the challenge that we face and the fact that we really need to do something about it. And I loved the anecdote or the characterization of the data that it's the equivalent of a 9/11 every 11 days, I think you said. And so I think the more we can make that prominent to the public and to Congress and those who fund these organizations would be really helpful. But as I think a little bit about how we grapple with China right now, China has been relatively low cost for them. This is something that they've been able to act with relative impunity, although that is changing, and have been able to see their adversaries suffer greatly from this epidemic and this crisis. So the way we need to sort of flip that narrative is to say, well, let's impose some costs. What are those costs for you? The fact that there were some sanctions and some indictments imposed upon them was part of the reason why Biden, she was willing to have this conversation with Biden, and why the working group that Ann Megram was a participant of was able to occur. We know in the past that China has been responsive on the methamphetamine fight when they knew that their reputation throughout the Southeast Asia, where it was really they were a huge contributor to that, was sullied, and it was having implications for their partnerships, and then more importantly, their own population started to use it. So they have, as we heard yesterday, the statistics now are 20% youth unemployment. The public statistics, there's a assessment that it may be much higher than that. That's a very vulnerable population if we can share that with them and help them understand what those risks are. If we can help remind them that they have promoted themselves as a anti-drug force for good in the world, and that reputation is definitely under threat. We share intelligence. I know that the FBI and the DIA do that now. Can we perhaps think about sharing some intelligence and say we could make this public and show to the world, like we did with Ukraine and Russia, what you are doing behind the scenes? And another thing that we may have in our favor right now is that there's certainly conventional wisdom is that the Chinese are going to try to lower the temperature in advance of the presidential election to avoid becoming a talking point and to avoid having either of the candidates affirm their stance against China in a way that they will need to execute on when they get into that position. So that's something to think about. And in the methamphetamine example, excuse me for going a little long here, in 2019, Australia put a lot of pressure on China. Abuse within China started to rise significantly, and China got very active in controlling the precursors that they were responsible for disseminating. So there is precedent for this.
So the one thing that really strikes me is how much of a U.S. problem this is, right? Is that this isn't this seems to be impacting us more than really everyone else. Do you, I guess in your view, is it like a time thing? Like we were first and is it starting to pop up in other countries? Or is this just because we were prescribing opioids and doctors were doing this and we developed basically a population of people who had dependence and substance use disorder, and then it's just purely, that was the start of supply and demand? Or do you think there's some other geopolitical issues that are driving that?
No, I think the overprescribing in the U.S. really set the stage for what's occurring now. That was the starting point. That's what opened the door to thousands and thousands of people that now suffer from opioid abuse. And that's really why, if you talk to other countries, they did not have that problem to start with. So they don't have that big opioid user population that fentanyl really plays into.
That's really interesting.
One point I might raise on that score is that when we want to collaborate with our European partners, it's only a matter of time for them. This will become more global. And so that's an opportunity for us to work with them and say, help us prevent this from becoming this really deadly crisis.
So Narcan is one of the drugs that you use to actually, it basically counteracts the effects of opioids. Do we get that from China as well? So one of the issues with Narcan is that some of the pharmaceutical companies that created the opioid problem were also providing the drug that solved the problem, right? And so you have this kind of interesting situation where they're profiting off of the problem they created to try to solve the issue. And is China involved in shipping us any of those drugs as well, or it's only the precursors for fentanyl?
I don't know. I'm sure that some of the naloxone and Narcan is produced in China. Yeah. I couldn't tell you what the number one country for that product is.
Okay. Yeah, it's just something I'm always interested in, is that the kind of, addiction's such a complex problem, and some of the people who are prescribing the drugs that cause it are the same people creating the drugs to try to solve it, and then they capitalize on that, and it's a really complicated
I do think
issue.
it's a good time to bring up, because with Narcan, and we talk about some of the medical interventions that are out there to prevent death. We heard mentioned earlier, I know during the DA administrator's speech, then also here with the nitazines and the xylazines, and although the overdoses present the same, they're not responsive to Narcan. So if it's they're non-opioids and they're synthetics, and I think we'll start to see more and more of those out there, whether it's adulterants and the drugs that we're seeing coming up, or just straight up across the darknet or other marketplaces. But I think it's very concerning.
So obviously this is the challenge in research as well, right? Is that we're researching things and new things are coming up and keeping up with the evolving landscape of these drugs. And so another big thing is that meth use is on the rise as well, right? And so you have interactions between meth and opiates. You're seeing xylazine pop up, which we haven't seen before. How do we, as like the U.S., stay ahead of kind of these trends, and how do we get on top of them before it's too late?
Well, one of the ways is we monitor what's being sold.
Okay.
And we buy chemical substances just to test, just to see what it is. We send it to our forensic labs just to see what it is and what the potential results are. The other thing is we employ a wide and vast group of informants that they pretty much keep us apprised at what's going on in the street, why it's happening, where it's happening, and that's another kind of a warning system we have. But no, it's ever changing. It's amazing what they're coming up with time and time again. And it's sad to say, but some of the users in our country, they're seeking these things like xylazine to be mixed with fentanyl because they're searching for a new experience. So that's kind of what we're seeing now is the powdered fentanyl coming in, and we have local gangs that have bought pill presses and they're manufacturing locally to kind of give their regional and local flair to the fentanyl, and which increases the harm and how deadly it really is.
So one of the things that is sort of interesting in terms of the research that we're doing is that we are capturing both what the women think they are taking as well as what they're actually taking. So we're doing drug testing and then discerning all the different drugs that are in their system while they're pregnant. So it was just sort of occurring to me like the mismatch between what you think you're taking and what you actually are taking. and then also the impact on the child as they
Do we know
growing.
what percentage of overdoses that are resulting from people unintentionally taking drugs that they thought were something else?
I don't know if we have a number. It's a big number.
Yeah.
It's a big number.
So I think one thing that struck me for a really long time is just like the impact of this problem, of substance use disorder in our country, right? Even the human life lost, the financial burden of this problem. Why do we not prioritize? Why is this not like one of the most urgent problems facing our country? I feel like COVID was a great comparator, right? Because it was obviously a problem. People recognized it was a problem, but the deaths from COVID were not. I mean, with substance use disorder, you have more. It wasn't even close in these short time periods where people started paying attention. Is it just because this has been something so ingrained with our society that we've always had a substance use problem, or like what do you think it is about this? Is it the stigmatization of the individuals that are taking this that's really influencing how the public views this? Sorry, I know that's like a hard question.
I think a lot of it does have to do with our culture, and we don't want to talk about these things. It's hard to sit around with your family and talk about these things, and because it has always been viewed as such a negative thing to have someone in your family that was involved in this. But now we haven't changed as a culture to be able to open up and talk about it, and I don't think we've addressed it because of that fact, because we still think that, oh, well, that's a problem that doesn't impact us, but in reality we all know that it's everywhere.
So I think one thing maybe, Laurie, you can talk a little bit about like the long-term impact, right? You're studying women who are taking these drugs, and then you're looking at how their offspring are developing and how it's changing how their brains develop, how they're making decisions. I guess like this is a huge problem for us because it's going to change a generation of individuals. And so I guess like the first thing is collecting data, but what's next?
What do we know now?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know that from the very start, newborns who are exposed to opioids in utero suffer from neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, or NOWS is what it's called. And 30 to 80% of kids who are born who are exposed to opioids will suffer from this, and it's sort of like mimics the withdrawal of what you have as an adult, but you're a little baby, you've just been born. So it really starts there, but it doesn't end there. Some of the things that we see later on that people have reported later on are increased anxiety and aggression that doesn't seem to go away. It persists. And then even if you have a child who's been born who doesn't suffer from NOWS, you still see they're still at risk. You might see that it doesn't sort of actually reveal itself until adolescence, some of these adverse effects, but they persist. And of course, anxiety and aggression is not a good, combined with already having a vulnerability for academic difficulties and cognitive difficulties. All those that pictured constellation together, we know is not a good one as you try to venture out into adulthood as an independent person.
Yeah, so basically this is a problem that's impacting us now, but also going to be impacting us for a long time. What's the most effective way to solve this issue? I mean, it sounds like we can't ban precursors from coming into the country because we need their use for other things. It's hard to put pressure on another country to do this. Are there things that the U.S. can do to really minimize the impact of this, like fast? Or is this like something that's going to take, decades of really negotiating with, partners across the world to try to solve this problem?
I mean, I think it's difficult, right? And I think that's what we've seen, and that's why sometimes where we are right now, but there is so much of it that's foreign policy, so much of it is diplomacy. But it is also like, and Will touched on this as well, is like we have to go after every angle of this. There's an infrastructure built up that allows these individuals, whether it's the precursor supplies or whether it's the actual peddling of these drugs, of these substances. There's an infrastructure there, and we have to hit every side of it. We have to look at and apply pressure on the tech companies that are enabling this, that allow this to happen, that could do more to stop it. I mean, there's so much that everyone in this room can do, but certainly we can do throughout the communities to address it.
So I don't know how much of the newer addiction comes from prescription, and I don't know if we know. I don't know if you all know that versus prescription versus people thinking they're buying something else. But one of the things that's always struck me when I've gone to the doctor and like had an operation and things like that is, and I've read this over and over and over again, is that before you prescribe people opioids, you should screen them for like a background of trauma and things like that. But I don't believe that our medical system is doing that. And perhaps it's irrelevant because the newer generation of users is not because of prescription of opioids. But if it is, that would be one place sort of in terms of systems.
Okay, so this is actually a really good question that came in. And we kind of touched on it before, but I think asking it again more directly is actually great. So I guess it's more for you all. In your view, is China's role in this just kind of non-state actors that are pursuing profits, and this is what the motivational drive? Or is there some aspect of, they benefit from unrest, so we're focusing internally, and that means we don't focus as much kind of externally? Or a combination of both, I guess it could be either.
I don't think that we've seen evidence that the Chinese government is promoting this behavior, but I would say the willful neglect is benefiting them. So they're complicit in that sense. As we talked about, the corruption and the top cover that these pharmaceutical companies have, the criminal groups that are trafficking these precursors are not the triad organizations that are prominent in Southeast Asia, but they also have a lot of political top cover, and they are complicit with the government in other aspects. We also see that if you look at President Xi Jinping's approach to his relationship with the United States and his interest in projecting power and influence globally, he describes the U.S. as a declining power, and the opioid crisis to him is in his narrative as part of that. So there are many benefits that they gain from this, and that would be the assessment that I would make.
Yeah, and I think it goes outside just the precursors, but to other crime, whether it's fraud, but also money laundering. I think there's an allowance. They maybe are aware that it's happening, maybe aren't directing it, but allow it to happen, which is frustrating our efforts. So.
Yeah. Okay. So in the last 5 minutes, I think we want to focus on this question. And so we talked about kind of how this is happening, the fact that this is a public health crisis. We clearly agree on that. But I guess, how exactly is this a national security issue? So like, how does this fit into national security, and exactly kind of what are the points there where this is the focus of this is national security?
Well, I think one thing is just what we touched on, like all the crimes that come with it, like whether it's the causing issues at the border through corruption, the violence on the streets. It's killing over 100,000 Americans every year. This is a crisis. It's affecting our security, our way of life, our economy. Like every kind of aspect of our country is being affected by it.
Okay, this is another really good question. So the House Select Committee on China just came out with a report saying that China is subsidizing the enabling production and sales of these precursors. If that's true, what does that imply in terms of our response? And so, is our response dependent on their intent? I mean, I guess the impact's the same, whether the intent is X or Y, but how does that change kind of how we respond as a government?
Well, I think several of the presenters yesterday mentioned asymmetrical warfare. And I think really the fentanyl is ripping apart the fabric of our society. Mm-hmm. It's a military readiness issue. If we don't have, we fight it all the time. We talk to our counterparts in CIS. this is a readiness issue as well. They have people that are getting kicked out of the military all the time for these issues. This is really degrading our society. And I think that it's done on purpose. I think it's very methodical, and they're living out a 100-year plan when we're not. And they're very unified. I would have not said this 5 or 6 years ago, but every crime we investigate, it's you find a Chinese angle to it. Money laundering, domestic cannabis production in the black market. 23 states now have been taken over by the Chinese, legal Chinese that are here in our country. They're setting up Bitcoin manufacturing facilities along with their marijuana grows. They are very strategic. They're very calculating, and I think that this is done to just weaken our society and our country.
On the subsidies issue, I have not seen that report, but I would note that the Chinese government does subsidize advanced technologies, and they have a whole spectrum of those that they engage in. You've probably heard about the green technologies that have benefited from a lot of state resources, and biotechnology is one of those areas. So certainly money is fungible. If they're funding biotechnologies in these pharmaceutical companies, that is to their advantage in producing precursors.
Okay, last question. So we're at Vanderbilt University, right? And I think the really cool thing here is you just saw a bunch of people come together across all of these areas with different perspectives. But what role do academic institutions or places like Vanderbilt have in solving these kinds of issues? And I guess, like, from your perspective, like, what kinds of conversations need to be happening, and like, how can we as a community facilitate these kinds of the advances in these areas? Like, that's right.
Well, I think the most important thing that I've witnessed over the last couple of days is just us all getting together to discuss these issues. Mm-hmm. I think that's very powerful. I'm always amazed when we do these type of events, the questions that we get asked, because I don't think people really truly understand how dire the problem is. So I think just by broadcasting this and putting us all up here, I think that's a very, very good first step.
Yeah, I also think just like this audience as being leaders in the community and your fields, and being able to take the message out. But there are things that we can do to help in this fight. It was touched on before, but encryption, like the law enforcement, we have no ability to lawfully access messages that these criminals are using to exploit everything we're talking about today. We know that it's being used, but there's no court that we can give us access to that content. That is something that needs to change, and it affects our crimes against children, children exploitation, sextortion, and certainly what we've been talking about here today. And I think just getting the message out, what the problem is, why it should be a priority for everyone, not just in this room, but everyone throughout our communities and through our nation.
I would just offer up there is still a dearth of China expertise in the government. So I'm always encouraging academic institutions to build their cohort of professors, Mandarin teachers, to build out that expertise. The government can really use those up-and-coming scholars to help us understand the Chinese thinking and the Chinese problem space.
And Laurie and I are over here trying to find a solution to this problem by studying drug development, trying to find drugs and things that change the problem of drug use. And so, it's kind of an interesting space because, drug companies haven't been as excited to go into these neuroscience-based disorders and things that don't have a huge return on investment. And so we have a really cool kind of situation where we're investing in just discovery without thinking about necessarily the outcome. We do well when things are developed, but it's more for kind of solving societal problems. And so I think it's a really neat space to come together and really realize the impact of that work.
Yeah, and I also think that, universities that are able to sort of function without silos and really work together across different fields, because if one thing that's very evident from this summit is that you need all sorts of different expertise to come to the table. And, surprisingly, that's not always easy in an academic institution, but there are some where there really are able to have a flow of information and teams, interdisciplinary teams that are built. So I have to be biased here and say that I think Vanderbilt is especially good at doing that.
I think it is too, and it's not just because they pay me to say that. So,
Yes. Nobody paid me to say that.
This was so fantastic. I think we can thank our speaker, our panelists, and thank you for listening.